It is a prime ingredient, feeding the fires of imagination. In eons past, it fanned flames ignited by a primeval author, chiseling random petroglyphs across a dim cave wall. This life-giving breeze once grew papyrus for paper, and dried vibrant oils brushed over canvas. Carried across the land since the dawn of time, it once breathed life into dinosaurs, and has since walked on the surface of the moon. Manifesting as a gentle zephyr, it stirs memories of childhood, or as a raging vortex, ripping up the pages of history. Powered by this influence, we dream, love, laugh, hate, and destroy. In short, live out our lives. A gust of this tempest carries the power to scatter fog surrounding the unknown. Drifting through frequencies of time and space, thin air is inhaled for the first time and exhaled at the last. Don't try to catch your breath. I suppose that it was only wishful thinking that there might be some kind of cushion or buffer to soften my landing. Now don't get me wrong. By some abstract miracle or freak of nature, I was finally off the shipwreck of the American Star, and that fact above all else was enough. And so I toppled through this misty portal, headlong into another dimension, to find myself struggling to maintain balance on the other side. Lifting myself to a sitting position, I took a look around, and for a fleeting moment feared that I had simply landed on a lower deck of the shipwreck with no paranormal intervention at all. Here too, the ambient light inside this long, narrow chamber was dim and reluctant to give up its secrets. Reaching into the pocket of my shorts, I traded the shiny coin I still held in my clenched fist for my trusty Bic, holding it out and striking it so as to push back my ever-present traveling companion, the darkness. In the flickering gloom, I saw that I sat crouched in the aisle of what I immediately ascertained was a coach-class passenger railroad car. The long room was lined on both sides with bench seats, each bolted to the floor and arranged next to a corresponding row of open rectangular windows that also ran the full length of the car. Deciding that the only thing that really took any damage during the fall was my pride, I stood up and turned a full 360 to further check things out. That's what it was, all right, a railroad car. Added bonus, no water anywhere. As I scanned the landscape rushing by outside, I could make out the shadowy forms of looming mountains and high vaulted peaks that poked craggy, silhouetted fingers into the starry night sky. Without any kind of reference, compass, or map to go by, I could only speculate that I was now traveling somewhere in the northwestern United States, maybe Oregon or Washington State. The rock-strewn cliffs and deep canyons speeding by were shrouded by a dense canopy of tall pine trees that I recognized as predominantly Douglas firs, native to the Pacific Northwest. Hey, I was way above sea level now. This was all good, I thought. Even the sound effects were a welcome departure from the crashing waves. Here, a cool, whistling breeze wafted into the cabin with a blustery rush, along with the commonplace clackety-clack of trucks on rails that one expects when riding a train. At least I'm on my way to somewhere now, I told myself. This was progress. Realizing that I was actually very fatigued from the events of the last 24 hours or so, I slumped down onto one of the benches nearby and propped my feet up. Upon closer examination, I could see that the cut on my leg, the one garnered during my little tussle with the American Star, was red and swollen, maybe a bit infected. Without really thinking about it, I called out, "Conductor!" Nothing a little first aid wrap or some spray disinfectant couldn't handle, I surmised. "Conductor? Hello?" No response. Come to think of it, not only was there no railroad worker on duty, there were no other people riding in my car either. Huh, I grumbled with a note of sarcasm. Must not be the mighty fine line they used to rave about. In a moment of real hell for leather macho, I thought about simply ripping off a long strand of my t-shirt and using it to bandage up my leg. Something very odd made me forget the idea entirely. I was wearing a different shirt than the one I had on in Fuerteventura. What the hell? I mean, yeah, so I was drunk, and I could have been wearing a hot pink crop top and wouldn't have given two shits about it. But no, I'm absolutely certain I had on a charcoal gray ringer. Even inebriated, I remember trying to scrub the garlic sauce off the front of me with a paper towel, and I know it was my gray t-shirt because the stain stuck out like a sore thumb. Now, I had on a dark blue frock. Surely, I thought, I would have remembered a wardrobe change. Maybe the gods were offended by my body odor / garlic blend and decided I needed a change of clothes midway down the frickin' rabbit hole. In any event, I chalked it up to yet another momentary neurosis and decided to let it go. Bigger fish to fry. Deciding that I'd just have to scrounge up a first aid kit for myself, I got back to my feet and made my way forward to the door at the front of the car. The train was rocking back and forth on a length of uneven track, enough that I had to catch hold of the tarnished latch and steady myself before pulling the door open. You know, I thought that after my little adventure on the shipwreck that I'd seen everything, certainly everything unexpected. At that moment, I realized that I was completely, terrifyingly wrong. There, on the other side of the entryway, I discovered that I had seemingly traded one dire situation for another. Where there should have been a locomotive and several more attached cars in the train, there was simply open track, extending out into the distance for as far as the eye could see. This, I realized, was a runaway train car, and I was now the unfortunate passenger who had unwittingly purchased myself a one-way ticket to ride. The dictionary definition of a gasp is a convulsive catching of breath, or, as a verb, to inhale suddenly with the mouth open out of pain or astonishment. Tate Addison, in every sense of the word, has just executed a textbook gasp, perhaps the singular reaction appropriate when presented with the harsh reality he has just now come face to face with on the other side of a Pullman car door. Breathe now, Mr. Addison, breathe. This is no time to hold your breath and pass out. Now is the time for action, lest you find yourself careening around a switchback and plummeting over the edge of a deep canyon with nothing between you and the ground but a few transient seconds of precious thin air. In much the same way that I greeted dizzying heights, suspended from a steel I-beam on American Star, I braced myself in the doorframe of the train car and racked my brain for some kind of immediate solution to this all-new, desperate circumstance. Even though this car was old, maybe 1940s or 1950s vintage, it still had to have a handbrake installed somewhere in case of emergency, most likely up a short ladder to the roof. Of course, the ladder was attached to the railing on my left, the side of the car facing the outside edge of the cliff face. Looking down from the top deck of the ocean liner was child's play in comparison. Here, the drop couldn't even be calculated beyond the treetops that rose out of the darkness, hundreds of feet below the edge of the roadbed. Here we go again, I voiced over the pounding and now rapidly accelerating clack-clack of the trucks. At least, I thought, it wasn't fast enough to keep time with the beating of my heart just yet. Taking hold of the iron railing with another white-knuckle grip, I climbed out from under the awning above the coupling platform and ascended several rungs up to the top. I could see the valve wheel from my vantage point, but was more than slightly alarmed that it wasn't within reach. I was going to have to let go of the ladder and take several steps over to the brake wheel with not so much as a single handhold in between. "Damn it!" I shouted. The car was still wobbling side to side on the track, as it continued picking up speed, enough that one wrong step would spell disaster. I can do this, I told myself. I have to do this. Cautiously, I unfurled one arm from the ladder and reached out toward the valve wheel, trying to assess the distance and how many steps it would take for me to get there from here. Letting go with my other hand, I planted my foot firmly on top of the roof and stepped out toward the brake. "Come to Papa," I shouted as I reached out with both hands and caught hold of the wheel. In nearly the same motion, I started cranking the wheel clockwise, tightening it down to a point that I hoped would lock a set of functioning brake pads against the iron wheels that in turn would bring this juggernaut to a stop. As it turned out, the brakes were still quite effective, so much so that they locked down hard with a loud screech and nearly jarred loose my grasp on the wheel. A rush of relief shot through me as I felt the metal friction grinding, tugging at the car and reducing what had now become considerable forward motion. Figuring it best to relinquish my lofty outlook in favor of more confined quarters, I clambered back down to the platform and waited for my pulse to slow. And so it would have, if not for what I now saw waiting for me a short distance down the track ahead. My runaway car was rolling to a stop all right. Slower and slower it continued on, unfortunately rolling out across a vast, staggeringly high trestle that bridged a deep valley between two mountains. Of course, by the time my Pullman finally lurched to a stop, it was situated more than halfway across the expanse, and there was no way in hell I was getting out to push. It occurred to me that I may have just placed myself back in a nearly identical scenario as being stranded on the star. Oh sure, there was a pathway out this time, teetering on weathered railroad ties like some crazed trapeze artist on a high wire, fighting back an overwhelming fear of heights, painfully aware that there are no railings, no handholds, and no solid metal support structure of any kind. Just the staggering view below, unrelentingly evident through gaping spaces between evenly arranged wooden beams. No, not now, at least not yet. As horrific and overwhelming as it was for me to comprehend this dangerous situation, I simply couldn't face one more life-or-death challenge. Resigned, I stepped back inside the car and shut the door behind me. Perhaps I could rest a while. Slumped across the floor so I couldn't see outside, I curled up in a near-fetal position, closed my eyes, and fought back lurking panic. I'll get on with all of this. Later. Much later. Even as I did so, I felt myself finally drifting off to sleep. Much later. I awoke with a start. Yeah, I might even go so far as to say it was a rude awakening. Something, a wounded bear, a rabid wolf, or maybe a fallen eagle, was screeching out across the valley below, loud enough that the echoes reverberated and bounced back several times between the cliff faces on either side of my lofty crow's nest. Granted, I'm no mountain man, but this voice, this tortured wail, was unlike anything I've ever heard before. Whoever or whatever was crying out, they certainly had a good set of pipes on them, because the cry lasted and remained sustained for a good 30 seconds or more before finally trailing off. Stranger still, every other sound in the forest had been silenced by this lone voice. Chirping birds didn't even resume their choruses until far after the shriek had subsided. Whatever the source, it brought me to my senses better and faster than a pot of black coffee. Gratefully, presence of mind is what I needed most right now, wide awake and with the dexterity of a mountain lion, if I was going to step across row after row of broken, rotting timbers on a course to the other side of this yawning abyss. Carefully plotting every step before ever moving a muscle, I climbed down from my battered coach and stepped around the railing until I stood squarely in the middle of the trestle. As long as I didn't look down through the spaces between the railroad ties, I could almost force the issue of extreme altitude from my thoughts. The morning sun was bright, and the view ahead was completely unobscured. "Okay, Tate, "Let's take a little walk," I said. No sooner than I had taken my first baby step forward, there came yet another animal cry from beyond the shrouded tree line. Lunging back to the perceived safety of the Pullman, I gripped the coupler and waited for the second bout of caterwauling to end. When it finally did taper off to a whisper that faded into the soft rustle of wind, I wasted no time venturing off once again, hoping that perhaps I might make it over to the other side of the cliff before being jolted by another blast. For all my gathered trepidation, the bridge timbers turned out to be surprisingly sturdy. Only once or twice did I detect the sickening crunch of splintering wood, and in both cases had sufficient time to reverse my footing and step around the weakened support. All of this was going rather well until I came to the broken edge of wood and rail. From the surface of the trestle, I couldn't see it. The arched support structure that the roadbed was constructed on was obviously still intact. Otherwise, the entire assembly would have been a crumpled pile of mangled wood, iron, and steel, smashed to bits on the valley floor. It was only when I had walked this far across that I found more than 500 feet of track and ties were gone, presumably crumbled away with age and collapsed to the ground, leaving only two long steel beams, each no more than a foot across, leading to safety. A flood of emotions hit me like a freight train. No pun intended. There was a stark realization that I had walked here for nothing. Even though the distant ridge beckoned to me, 500 feet on a beam 12 inches wide? No thanks. There was a sudden realization that had I not activated the brakes on the Pullman car, I'd be resting with the angels on a riverbank, hundreds of feet down. Then there was knowing that I faced backtracking to the car, halfway across the trestle, and then a trek of equal distance back the way I came, to finally set foot on solid ground. In complete contradiction to my self-proclaimed acrophobia, I stepped up to the splintered lip of the shattered bridge and sat down with my legs dangling out over thin air. Believe it or not, I even leaned forward with my hands on my knees and took a look straight down. The whole view stretched out like an accordion, and I wobbled back and forth on the brink of fainting, but somehow I managed to focus on what looked like a tiny children's toy, crushed to scattered pieces and strewn across a debris field that littered the riverbank far below. Even though it was a long way off, there was no mistaking that the wreckage I was seeing was that of my Pullman car. Same rusted paint scheme, same 40s or 50s retro styling, same everything. Only now it wasn't perched high atop a rickety old railroad bridge. It was laying on its side in the middle of a river, way, way down in the valley beneath me. "Oh my God," I exclaimed. Had I really passed out and the thing rolled right over me and off the edge of this break? Jerking my head around, I looked back across the bridge behind me and saw that the Pullman was still sitting right where I left it, a tiny outline on the otherwise flat roadbed surface. My brain reeled as I glanced back and forth between the smashed derelict below and the relatively intact train car I remember riding to get here. No doubt about it, they were one and the same. How? I have no idea. Having jumped through a wormhole to escape my last unfortunate event, these little bits and pieces of unexplainable phenomenon were beginning to seem commonplace to me, if that makes any sense at all. And so I stood up, brushed myself off, and started back in the opposite direction across the trestle. Walking with a little more spring in my step, I was actually somewhat humored that this entire experience, in all of its whimsical nuances, was therapeutic, forcing me to come to terms with a few of my undesirable character flaws. Who knows, if I ever finally get where I'm going, I might have to take up skydiving just to counteract everyday normalcy. The thought actually made me chuckle out loud, a welcome reaction to a very stressful set of circumstances. It took about 10 minutes or so to retrace my ginger steps back to the Pullman car. The wind up here was pretty strong, and several times en route, a gust would whip up enough of a nudge that I intentionally hit the deck between the rails to avoid getting blown overboard. As I hobbled along to within about 50 feet of the car, surprise, surprise, another odd thing happened. Well, first, before the odd thing happened, I was looking at the car and I was thinking to myself that something seemed amiss. Somehow, the cone-shaped light mounted on the outside of the railing had switched on, just lit up all by itself. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Angle of the sun, shadows of birds flying high overhead. Sadly, none of these explanations held up under close scrutiny. Then, the next oddity. The Pullman car was now moving. Yes, in fact, rolling straight at me with this one gleaming tail light staring me down like an oncoming mechanical cyclops. Of course, simply stepping out of the way would be the logical course of action, and that's exactly what I did. Thing of it is, though, I'm not entirely sure my little sidestep was even necessary. As the car rolled by me on a collision course with destruction, I observed that the vehicle was actually becoming semi-transparent, fading in opacity like a puff of smoke before my eyes. I would have expected to feel some sort of vibration in the track or the timbers beneath my feet, but there was nothing. Like the train car was little more than a phantasm of itself. Extending my arm, I took a couple of steps forward, enough that my outstretched hand should have penetrated the wooden frame, and my fingers touched rows of empty seats inside. I felt nothing. The car passed by me with the slightest stirring of a breeze that barely tousled my hair. Relocating to the center of the trestle, I watched the Pullman car as it continued down the track into the distance. By the time it reached the collapsed segment of the bridge, it was just barely discernible, a wisp of an object that careened forward and dropped out of sight completely. I waited, listening intently, but never heard the splash or a thud of it hitting the river or the muddy forest floor. With no particular destination in mind, I started walking back across the other side of the trestle, intent on climbing down into the valley to see the crash site for myself. About 3/4 of an hour later, I arrived at the edge of the mountain where the bridge connected with solid ground, and the gnawing fear of falling finally gave way to calm relief. I sat down on the side of the pebbly roadbed and for a long while contemplated my options. High on the list now was hunger, realizing that the last thing I had to eat would have been a few beer nuts at the bar in Fuerteventura. Even those got washed down by ample amounts of alcohol and were long since digested. I wouldn't say that I'm much of a hunter, and I wouldn't know a poison berry from a hill of beans. I will, however, count fishing as part of my outdoor skill set, so chalk up one more vote for a trek down the ridge. Deciding it would be best to tromp into the woods with some daylight left, I looked for a break in the underbrush and headed out as quickly as possible. Scaling the side of the cliff actually proved much easier than expected. Most of the journey helped along with an ample supply of tangled tree roots, vines, and rocks to step on or cling to. By late afternoon, I had reached the bank of the river, and from there, picked up the pace, stepping over rocks and tightly packed mud and dirt, until finally I saw the Pullman car, tipped over and half submerged in a wide, deep pond, a good portion of it grounded on the bank and extending into the dark tree line. One thing I was sure of as I examined the scene, this train car didn't just land here a couple of hours ago. It was in bad shape when I was riding it down the track, but there was still a noticeable coat of deteriorating paint covering a good portion of the outside surface. This poor smashed derelict was nothing more than a rusted hulk, every square inch crusted in corrosion from what I would estimate to have been years of lying here in the dank humidity and continuously flowing water. As with this entire adventure, yet another staggering contradiction. The stomach started complaining loudly about the lack of a square meal, so I located a sapling tree and broke off a fairly stout stick, whittled it down to the end with my trusty pocket knife, and then hopping up on the exposed side of the train car started scanning the pond for a nice, tasty trout. The water was crystal clear, and I could plainly make out several likely candidates for a late lunch, but after a couple of quick jabs and frustrating misses, something caught my eye, a reflection on the surface of the water. I could see myself clearly enough, but that wasn't what I noticed. Forming a semicircle around the train car behind me was something vaguely familiar. A cloud-like ring of green fog, slowly rotating around the broken Pullman and forming a glowing tunnel into the forest. There was no denying it. Although the coloration varied, the phenomenon was strikingly similar to the misty vortex that had encircled the stack of the American Star and provided an escape from my confinement there. "Looks like maybe someone is trying to tell me something," I said, turning to look at the shimmering doorway. No mistake, this was the same kind of effect, though climbing into this ring of emerald mist was going to be a tight fit, as it hugged the car with very limited space in between. Then I remembered how I arrived at this scenario, falling through the doorframe of the train itself. Instinctively, I stepped up to the exposed end of the car that was partially underwater and readied myself to jump in. I would need to walk up the inside of the Pullman to be able to pass through this particular portal. At the same moment that I stood up on the frame of the flooded doorway and prepared to jump, I was jolted by yet another frightening animal cry like the ones I had heard high up on the trestle, only this time, whatever it was really, really close. Glancing over my shoulder in the direction of the scream, I heard the rustle of leaves and twigs breaking underfoot. With nothing more than my makeshift spear for protection, I made the split-second decision to go ahead with my planned escape. As the forest passed from my field of view in mid-air leap, I thought I noticed some kind of shadowy form emerging from the brush out of my peripheral vision. For the brief time that I was completely beneath the water, I definitely heard another loud splash that wasn't my own. Whatever this thing was, it was right on my heels. Gripping the first row of submerged bench seats, I pulled myself up into the car, and then using each bench as a handhold, scaled the slippery chamber as fast as I could. 3 chairs away. 2 chairs away. I heard my pursuer breach the waterline behind me, coming up gasping for air with a hideous, rasping growl that was most certainly not uttered by human vocal cords. Whatever it was, it must have attempted the same method to ascend the angled rise of the car, but fortunately for me, the first bench splintered and tore free from the floor under what must have been an immense weight, causing the creature to lose its balance and tumbled backwards with a loud splash, back down to the sunken platform. Much like my escape from the American Star, I saw no other option but to fling myself across the threshold of this gaseous ring of emerald light. As I passed across the dimensional doorway, I heard the beast pull its head back above the water behind me and scream in defeat, watching the circle of smoke collapse between us and gradually dissipate into thin air. Once upon a time, a man named Tate Addison lost his way and stumbled off a beach in the Canary Islands to become a missing person. Lost, then again found, wandering in the wilderness, the hapless commuter aboard a runaway train. Now the question persists. What do we really know about the progression of time? Does it simply pass in perfect chronology as we while away the hours from the cradle to the grave? Or conversely, could time be a dimension unto itself, a series of fluid channels and eddies that meander from past to present to future and back again? Surely, Mr. Addison was a passenger on a train. Before that, the unwitting tourist aboard a beached ocean liner. But then, when was he actually aboard either of them as a paying patron? When did the purser stamp or the conductor punch his ticket to ride? In the current tense, the Pullman car was rolling, out of control and backwards toward a broken bridge it could not possibly have been towed across, hitched to a locomotive. Could it be that it was actually traveling backwards, not just by virtue of unhitching from a train? Was it also barreling counterclockwise toward some kind of singular event that hadn't happened yet? Did Tate see it plummet from the trestle? Or did he just witness a visual echo of something that happened long, long ago? And what of the inexplicable entity that Tate encountered in the forest? Difficult to say, really. If nothing else, a gentle nudge in the right direction. A strange manifestation of distorted space-time. Maybe all of this is neither here nor there, inconsequential as we continue our search for him, somewhere in the misty reaches of thin air. Episode 3 of the Thin Air Podcast Anthology, The Passenger, Chapter 2, A Fine Line, was written, produced, directed, narrated, and told by R.J. Lonsdale. Music compositions used in this episode include Mysterious City, Echoes in Time by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0, and Flight Hymn by Ross Bergden. This has been an R.J. Lonsdale Flyby Studios presentation.